We're here in Edinburgh, and we are in the Botanical Garden, which Alec Finlay, whom we're about to introduce, tells us is one of the two oldest such gardens in, let's just say, Europe. And we're here, and it's just absolutely a pleasure to be here. So we have Browne, she of a recent big birthday. I guess we're going to keep talking about that for a few more days. And Laynie Browne, no relation, or much relation.
Yes.
And Sophia DuRose.
Hi. Hi.
And we are absolutely honored to have Alec Finlay here with us. Alec, thank you for, co-curating this moment with us. Can you, before we get started talking about one of your poems, can you tell us a little bit about this particular setting?
Yeah, we're in the native garden, the wild garden in the Botanics, and we're in an area that's dedicated to the National Memorial for Organ and Tissue Donation, which I made a few years ago. And it's like an artwork, but also a place of remembrance. And when they originally commissioned me, they imagined a formal sculpture in the middle of a lawn where, in that way we have now, people would make a very public act of remembrance, kind of what we call post-Diana. But I knew that people would be coming who had grief, and for grief you have to have somewhere intimate and private. So this is really the only intimate, quiet, natural feeling area of the whole garden. And I had to discover it. It wasn't like this. It was a neglected corner. I had to bend down under the branches, and I call it a wilding garden. So everything here is local, localist, native. It's ecologically it belongs. And so it's not really meant to be just a formal artwork. It's meant to be a place you can reflect and bring pain, loss.
Thank you. This aligns really well with the conversation we're about to have, because you, as an artist, including you as a poet, as a writer, are interested in art in spaces that, I just want to say, allow the space its natural state, but also don't shy away from having something that a person creates in it. And the poem we're going to talk about is called Billia Croo, and I think rather than setting it up, why don't we just ask you, if you don't mind, to read it, and then we can just get started on a conversation about it.
Billia Croo is on the west coast of mainland Orkney, the island of Orkney. So if you imagine you're in a place where the next stop is America, and the waves are coming over the Atlantic. Billia Croo. Culture is richest where there's the greatest ratio of land to coast. Barry Cunliffe. This patch of the Western Ocean's coruscating garden recalls my favourite song, mishearing the sea's very humdrum. But no, there's not that one ocean, not when such an infinite mix of blues can outshine the map's cerulean. The sea is there for a Solon to push his wings against or plunge in, reinventing the medium. When the light comes right through them, the waves let slip rack and tangle, pitching round until they go breaking on the boulder beach, crashing under Rowhead, hassling brittle stars and urchins, or splash near the shell ducks dozing on their green sun shelf. There's no need to worry that any wave is wasted when there's all this motion. Along the bay, there's the promise of a new world from each new device, connected to the cable that runs out under the wild rocks into the diamond space inside those three boys. This is where the metal gets salt wet, and that's the only true test. The problem is elastic. What kind of roots will grip fast with moorings, subject to ebb, flood, flux in a surge of such force. What solid was once liquid, as with rock and sand, which nature divided like us. These waves were tugged and formed in slowness that we've lost. For there's no way to relearn the tide's happy knack of infinitesimal growth, except by slushing around or waiting, stranded on the heave of the moon.
I would love to get some responses and thoughts and then ask Alec to respond to the responses. So who wants to start? Leanne, do you have a thought? Take us anywhere? You're raising
I
your
love
hand.
I love the line about my favorite song, mishearing the seas, very humdrum, and that the whole poem seems to be a song of nature, but also of the place names and how the place names sort of echo the natural sounds of the waves, and things like
Love that. Laynie, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was also really drawn to that line and thinking about how, in a way, it's all about listening and hearing, the unhearing and then the re-listening in order to be in relation with the dynamic, mutable nature of the environments.
Lovely. Sophia?
I was thinking a lot about coastlines. I was thinking about Joan Retallack saying languages and coastlines operate with the same kinds of principles, right? Like this site of mutually transformative exchange between complex systems that are patterned and in constant flux. And I'm curious what that says about power, both like the cultural significance of power, but like the physical power that Billia Croo produces, right?
Cool. All right, I'm going to add one, Alec, and then you can take it anywhere you want, and then we'll respond to your response to the response. I read this poem, well, maybe the fourth time through, I read this poem as an educator, as someone who is constantly thinking about, am I in the right space for teaching and learning? Am I doing what I'm supposed to do in the situation, in the spot, in the place? And most times I think I come up failing because I'm in a classroom or something obvious like that. But your declaration at the end, there's no way to relearn the tide's happy knack for infinitesimal growth except by sloshing around, etc. It seems to me that there's a relationship between relearning and that sloshing, which is thought of as imprecise and merely pleasure-seeking, aimless, directionless, and yet in the context we're going to talk about, which is using waves to help us in a almost scientific way, that pedagogy becomes very specific. So it's intentional sloshing that you get to, and that's how the only way you're going to relearn. You've got a lot you can respond to. You want to go anywhere?
Yeah, I think my next book may be titled Intentional Sloshing. And beautiful responses. And I haven't read this poem in a long time, and I was experiencing it not as the author. So your responses were very strong for me as a kind of guide to what's meant to be my own poem. There is an interesting dynamic in the poem between human fallibility, sloshing, and that comes into this song. I've always sung along. It's an orange juice song, so it's classic Scottish 80s fey jangly pop when men were allowed to be a bit gentle and wear fisherman's jumpers. And it was a very beautiful moment in Scotland where these bands, Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, where they were very articulate and had a very new take on masculinity. But I always used to sing that line as the sea is very humdrum, but it's actually the scene is very humdrum. So it's actually an urban song, and it's a reference to the Sex Pistols. So within that misunderstanding, there's my own typical pastoral inclination, but I love you know, these misrememberings. The Ritalic is a perfect summary of the philosophy which is behind the poem. I want to try and say something. So I sat there in this coastal place, which is unusual in that it's natural. There's power, the force of these waves, and yet something is happening there which is absolutely current. And
Current is a pun almost.
yeah, and the sea, and the sea, I mean, in that, so Williams is in there with, you know, one of the first poems I really love, with the sea as a garden. So what does that mean there? So being there, I absorbed the place, and I also absorbed the names, which I'll come back to. But the genius of the poem is actually the designers of the devices. So there's a wider body of work here I made where I was interested in these new renewable devices which are being tested there. It's one of the most important test sites in the world. And yet, if you look in the book, you will see photos of cows grazing next door. And when you go to Orkney, it's a very amazing, remarkable landscape, because there's some of the most important Neolithic monuments, which are older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, which speak to technology of stone. There is then this technology of the sea, which goes through the Norse incoming. The language is mostly Norse. So there's a genius of the sailor, and they used language to describe each inlet in terms of its force. Is it safe? Is it not safe? What is the tide like there? No one really walked there. You sailed everywhere. The Cunliffe quote, Cunliffe wrote a book about the Celts. He's the main archaeologist of the Celts. And he says the same thing as Ritalac, which is essentially, there's a natural genius to clusters of islands. One thinks of Greece here too, because you have intercultural connections, you have multicultural, multi-language, multi-myth. So that's part of the genius, comes from nature, but it's to do with, Cunliffe really says almost like there's a ratio. A ratio, the more coast you have, the more genius you have. I don't need to know if that's true, but it's a wonderful thought. So the intricacy of nature, you know, a little bit like, is it in The Hitchhiker's Guide, where Norway is God's masterpiece? You know, the fjord, the sense of nature being a made thing that has an intelligence. And then these designers are the latest human occupiers to try and craft a vessel. It used to be boats, then it became, you know, windmills, different kinds of mills. Now it's these renewable devices. So when you're at Billia Croo, you're in this coastal setting. There's this a raised beach, a storm beach, McDermott being in that with his love of his memories of being in Scotland and writing on a raised beach, his feeling for stone. But what they're really doing is using their ingenuity to test devices. And I sat with one of these designers and a very interesting anthropologist called Laura Watts, who writes about this intelligence that they're developing about the sea. And he would say such wonderful things as, in effect, most devices fail, and that's how you learn. And all of this became poetry for me. And I began to have a fantasy that, and this is where Christie's work would be relevant, that dialect poetry, dialect and placings has an energy that standard English doesn't. And I began to have a fantasy that you could create energy from poetry. So going back to Olson, but translating Olson into these genius poetic engineers who are living in this pastoral setting. And you'll meet them in the pub, you know, with the fishermen, and they'll be talking about how they're getting on with the sea. So the poem has these moments. So it talks about the diamond. The diamond is these buoys which are marking out where the devices are. The devices are bought there from all over the world. People come from Malaysia, South Korea, America to test at this one place because the waves, it's like a surf place in a way. It's like people were going to surf the waves. Instead, they're going to test them. They also have a massive Google storage under the sea there. So I'm very interested in these places where they're more usually military, but where you have human ingenuity, device, and pastoral together. So the poem is me sitting with that, and the language is trying to allow, like the brittle stars are, the language of the poetic feeling for place, but some of the language is more about metal and about how waves work. What is a wave, which is what the engineers are trying to understand. And finally, what I was trying to think about was the way intelligence translated between 5,000 years of people in boats, understanding how a boat works in those very wild seas, to these new people, many of whom are incomers, who are thinking about a different kind of device. But they're all still devices with propellers, they're things that turn. So it's about turning, motion, energy, and how a thing survives with power, how we relate to power.
Wow. Laynie, Browne, what are you thinking in response to that amazing?
Wow, there's so much to respond to. I was thinking about your statement that most devices fail, and that's where we learn. And then the gloss you just gave us on the mishearing of the Sex Pistol song, and how, in a way, it all speaks to this need to try and try and try and include more voices than more than human intelligence, until we get to the point that there is no difference between the Sex Pistol song and the song of the land. In other words, that's one way in which to think about our culpability. The songs of the land, the songs of the human, the slogging in the water, so we're not feeling separate.
The sea is very humdrum until a poet says the sea is a garden, and the sea is this and the sea is that. So
brilliant. You mentioned Williams, his early poem called Flowers by the Sea, in which he says, I can do a figuration, a metaphor of the sea like a flower, and I can do the figuration of a flower that's like the sea, responding, opening. But actually, the point is not to do those separately.
And the moment in Orkney, in this moment, there's a moment in early technologies when they are essentially metaphors. So all these engineers are coming up with designs for what are basically like flowers. I call wind turbines wind flowers. If you look at them, they're all trying to make the perfect flower that will turn in water and survive. And that's the bit that is like nature, that there will be a device that comes out of it, out of all the failure, which is the survivor, and we will benefit from that.
It evolves.
It will be like the herb that grows in the Amazon that we haven't found yet that will cure long COVID. So that's what's going on in it, and it's not. I'm not the expert. They are, but the scientists don't know that they're dealing with metaphor.
This is why the poem says, and that's the only true test. The problem is elastic, right? And conjuring Alec, Caroline Bergvall, who's interested in coastlines, as definitive and non-definitive. That's why we turn when we see what solid was once liquid, as with rock and sand, which nature divided like us, these waves were, etc., etc. So we need to be at that spot in order to know our definite non-definitiveness as solid liquid.
And the poet does that by listening and not being the expert.
Leanne?
Well,
What are you thinking?
Free associations I'm having is I'm thinking of the Aeolian harp in the window with the wind blowing through, and this is like a sea harp, and it's got the device of the poem are these mostly 7 groupings of couplets. The first part's shorter, but it's like waves. And you say device, so I'm always going back to poetry. What is the technology that you're using, and you're trying to discover and fail at or get better at, to make a better poem. It's like that kind of reinvention. Yeah.
And just to say something about that this is what I call a proper poem.
Yeah.
And I don't write that many of them. But the poem exists within a book where there's a dictionary in the back of the book, a poetic dictionary of tidal language. There are photos of the devices showing the metaphors. For me, in a kind of modesty, the listening is that there is also work outside of that poem, which is telling and listening to and sharing the beauty of those devices and their fragility.
Sophia, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking specifically about this couplet, from each new device connected to the cable that runs, because I was thinking about internet cables, because there's, like 1.5 million kilometers of submarine fiber optic cables that underpin our like global internet. And I was thinking about the difference in opposition when I first read this poem, like the opposition of those cables versus these generators. And but now that I've heard you speak about it, I'm thinking of them less as an opposition, imposition, and I guess they're not in opposition either. And how and how this poem came to be because of these cables and this power and like waves creating aesthetic and poetic waves, which are a new kind of device of their own accord, and what can be born from a poetic wave. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a real cable.
Yeah.
And that's what was so interesting. The cable is like the signifier of the poetics of the technology. The cable is humdrum, but it's part of it. So it's a little side story, but one of the interesting things about Orkney. So Orkney is the most advanced place for renewable energy in the UK. They have hydrogen-powered buses. They had the first windmill turbine in the UK. It was put up there in 1950 and it blew down. It failed, which proved we could make one that worked. And Orkney produces more than 100% of its own energy. Wow. And they won't give it a cable to the mainland to share its energy. So cables are also a primary indicator of empire, power, force. And that was what was interesting about the focus of the cable. The cable, like who owns the cable?
Yeah.
The Orcadians are not allowed to put a cable in. There was a cable run, I think, from the UK to Iceland, and they wouldn't let it, Wow. It's classic empire. I could go on and on about this. When you meet them there, they are both these, it's like being in a Virgilian pastoral, but also in Solaris. It's kind of this strange, and it's very comfortable. They're all very comfortable with the newness of this technology and with the Neolithic. I mean, it coexists is a better word. And that is incredibly inspiring because we're used to all energy being crisis, struggle, force, power, war, death, end of planet. And so they are really, I call it Orcadia. It is a kind of vision of what the world could be. Not to romanticize it, it's really there. So the cable is part of that. And the poem is just that I was the first poet that sat there and just let that come in. I've also been to the site of this windmill turbine from 1950, which is completely forgotten. There's no plaque, no memorial. It's just the top of a hill and a few concrete braces that once held it up. So I love these sites where a poem first came into existence. One last thing for this, come back at me if you want, but it's all about energy. When I was 21, I got myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, what you call chronic fatigue syndrome. I now have long COVID. I probably couldn't walk to that beach anymore. The walk here today, that's about my limit. So I do a lot of work around healing and energy, and I help a lot of people who now have a chronic debility with energy. And I try and think about that in terms of adaptation, creativity, and how do we learn to live with less energy? And the experts in that are the people that don't have energy. So there's, behind the poem is this thinking about, well, what is energy actually? What are the waves in our body? What is the fuel in our body? We have the equivalent of the tide, of petrol, of honey. So that's behind my interest in energy, is a kind of secret, which I write about in other work, about not having energy. And Orkney would have been one of the last places that had a mains energy. They used to have windmills there way back because they weren't given power. So often ingenuity comes from lack, from oppression, from lack of provision. So that's another little thing maybe.
I think before we go soon for a final round of final thoughts, I think it might be cool if the four of us, in turn, just asked questions. Could be big or small. I have a big one. Just ask questions of Alec, and then he can just decide how to respond to any or all of the questions. Okay? So I'll start, because I just sprung this on you. You have no idea. And you just sort of answered my question, but whatever. How does this poem, Billia Croo, that is part of what you describe as the world's first poetic primer on marine renewable energy, how does this project connect to your life's work, to your overall project? I'm thinking particularly of your passionate feeling that poetry cannot be just verse on a page, that really shouldn't be only that, but it really needs to find its site specificity. So that's my question. It's a big one. Leanne, you were tossing four questions. Sorry to do this, but
No, I just want to throw out my free association of, now I'm looking at the poem as a cable, a long cable, and also an umbilical cord. And I'm thinking about your comment about this is a proper poem, how you want to make a poetry that's accessible, but it also has a complexity. And I'm just also free associating about my favorite project of yours is the Ringa platform, where you built a platform where everybody write together. So I'm just putting these associations, like how, this idea of a connection.
Okay. Laynie, your question?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question, what is energy, that you raised. And the poem does, I think, have some thoughts there that we can get to later, but I wondered about the connection to your term place awareness and the question of what is energy.
Wow, okay. Sophia?
I'm thinking about this line, there's no need to worry that any wave is wasted when there's all this motion. I'm thinking, is anything actually waste in nature, or is that a human kind of capitalist mindset to impose this binary of productivity and waste? And can that exist in simultaneity with nature's version of waste, if there is such a thing?
Well, I don't really think of them as questions so much as things the poem made you feel. And as I said at the beginning, I'm happy to feel a kind of distance from the poem. There's a pleasure in that, to recover it. don't quite know how I wrote it, but I remember sitting there. And it came out of little fragments that I wrote there. And as I've explained, a lot of the poem came from listening to other people. And a lot of my work comes that way. I used to talk about shared consciousness. The mystery of us is, and Al, this is to pick up a little bit on what you were asking. So I have no life work. I don't know what a life work would be. I have a series of occasions that I'm invited into. You know, I had to have funding for that book to happen, and it allowed me to go there and sit and be with those people, and there isn't a strategic cable. But my work is often about healing and listening. And I think in the uncertainty of the poem, it often will keep saying, I'm just these waves, this body of fragility, vulnerability, and yet there's something remarkable happening here, which is happening in a dialogue between the human and the sea. And I come back to this remarkable feeling that the technology wasn't there 20 years ago. There were, it was just a beach, and now it is there, and it might save us. You know, that the ocean is the largest source of untapped energy. That will never be simple. The poem talks about the brittle stars on the ocean floor. You know, there is a tension there. So I came in to my adult life as someone very ill with a lack of energy. This thing happened to me when I was at university. All my friends were going along the cable into work, into life. They had normal energy, and I never could pass into employment, job, those structures. And it took a long time, in a way, to use, very clumsily, the creative to find an alignment, like sitting on that beach. And so growing up where I grew up, at Little Sparta, there's a feeling of searching for belonging. So I think the poem is about, all right, how can I belong here, and how are we belonging here? What is it that's happening here? And it's an interesting poem because there's a genius of the place, but the poet who's writing is quite often allowing a flow of sloshing around. So coming into the world in that way with an energy lack, with pain, fatigue, it took me 30 years to begin to write about that, to identify as disabled, to think about what that meant. And place awareness is really just my version of eco-poetics. But my version primarily comes from an awareness of place names and what they hold as knowledge. In Scotland we have Shetlandic, Orcadian, Norse, but primarily Gaelic place names. So our maps don't belong to us. I'm English speaking. So when I look at the map, if I want to understand where I actually am, I have to learn that. Slightly different from being in New England, where there are a lot of Newtown, and so I couldn't walk up hills, and yet I love being in wild places, and it was just stupid. I was constantly going to them and getting exhausted. So I had to learn to sit, and I used names of the bits up the mountain to feel like I belonged. So names contained a knowledge of nature. And eco-poetics, it would tell me that people had grazed cattle in this place, they'd gone to this place for the summer, to collect blaeberries. And so I could imaginatively feel like I could go up the hill. And I didn't get up to the top of a hill till I was 50. And yet I kept being commissioned to make work in these mountainous landscapes.
Amazing.
And this is what art does. Art sometimes allows you to go to access things that you wouldn't normally have permission to access. We self-nominate ourselves. We go, I am going to go to a military base, a rape crisis centre, whatever it is we choose to go to, and I am going to be the listener. I'm going to let the language slop around in me and pass through me. So that's an attempt to try and bring together, and probably at the heart of it all is a curiosity about vulnerability as wisdom. And I think that's what poetry has.
That is powerful and memorable statement of art and statement of life. Wow.
Final
you know,
thought.
we usually do final thoughts. Alec has just done the best final thought ever, but why don't the four of us
Take away the
add...
final thought.
All right,
Yeah.
let's add 4 final thoughts to this.
You're looking
Who
at
wants to go?
I
I'm
can
looking at
go.
you. Do you have one?
Yeah, I'm just want to repeat what you said, imaginatively go to the top of the hill as a precursor to anywhere we want to go. It seems like an important key to the energy being in the collectivity of the spaces, like the brittle stars and the all the colors of cerulean that are mixing. And just even on our walk here, seeing comfrey leaf, a healing plant, and nettles, and the willows that you were showing us, that seems to be that being in conversation and being a part of the landscape seems to be one key to trying to understand more about what is energy.
Lovely. Leanne, you have a final thought?
I just wanted to come back to, you've said brittle stars twice, and I just love that image of like, I guess they're like sea stars, like the
Yeah.
not fish thing that grows and lives as a star on the ocean floor, but just that mirroring of the heavens.
Wow, love
In the
that.
last line.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, last one.
Moon.
Sophia DuRose?
It does feel cosmic. I like what you said. You said, how are we belonging here instead of why? And I feel like these final lines of waiting stranded on the heave of the moon is kind of telling us why. Like it's this cosmic patience that we have to learn.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
My final thought has to do with something that you said along the way at the very beginning about Orkney. It's west, and if you look west from there, the next land would be North America. I think you said United States. And that you were implying that the waves come from there. And I guess this is a little bit of self-reference for us, because we've come across that ocean to meet you and others here. And not to generalize about Scottish contemporary poets and artists, because how are we going to do that? But a common thread has been the sort of thing we're talking about now. We just finished in Glasgow talking with the aforementioned Christy Williamson, who writes in Shetlandic and who goes there every summer to be with his elderly parents and brings his own children and thinks about these same things. So I guess what I'm saying is that I feel like, this is such a Laynie Browne thing to say, I feel like we came along with those waves from the west, not to Orkney, darn it, 'cause that would have been great. But this is good, this is a good setting, a stand-in. You know, to, I don't know, be part of the trying to recover the slowness that we've lost, meaning Americans and American poets. And I think of the sort of main problem I have with William Carlos Williams, also important figure to so many people who think about these issues amazingly still. But the main failure of him was what I often call appetitiousness, desire and energy, and kind of a personal, blustery. There's not a lot of sloshing going around, even though there are some great sloshing poems. So I feel like we've come together along that wave, and maybe picked up a little of this new kind of energy. That was so corny, but I felt it.
I love it.
I'd like to
That's great.
say that this sounds almost planned, but when I came to poetry, I didn't come to British or Scottish poetry. You know, the first poetry book I picked off my dad's shelves was Creeley's For Love. And then I went to Niedecker, and then I went to Williams. And they were poetry for me. So the waves, but also you come over the wave into my kitchen.
You're reciting the syllabus of my
That's right.
And when I listen to you, and I've written this, I think, to you, Al, or to
Yes, you have. Thank you.
that I don't just listen to it as a discussion of poetry. I find your discussions some of the best conversation I listen to, because you listen to each other. And the poem itself is not always the most important thing. It's an occasion that we meet around. So that's what I'm feeling. It's very gentle here today.
Sing into the choir. I mean, yes, that wasn't planned, nor was the comment you made at the beginning about the waves coming from America and we're here, and my picking that up at the end. But it certainly has a roundness.
And Williams is great because he's had plenty of failure going on.
Yes, that's right.
And some of the ones that are more perfect and not always as useful. Let's be a bit forgiving.
I think I'm very forgiving of Williams. Not some of my colleagues, not so much.
Perfect failures.
Leanne Browne, thank you.
Oh, yes.
As always,
Thank
I
you.
have
This
this
is
great
great.
privilege of the sun has decided to have a spot at this moment in the morning here. And so it's shining through an opening that's been created partly by a little pond behind you, and the sun is on your hair.
Oh,
and
yes.
We're
So I-
exactly north-south aligned here. The
so you
entrance of
are
the
part of
artwork is...
my north-south alignment.
All right.
And I'm sure that
You're looking
that
north.
that Zach, who this is a meta reference to filming, who's behind me, is not happy that I'm leaning into the north-south axis. Laynie Browne, thank you so much as always. Sophia DuRose and Alec Finlay. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have this conversation.
Me too.